بداية هذه الفكرة كانت بداية دول مجلس التعاون بانضمام 6 دول، ونشوف الكثير من الامتيازات التي قدمت لمواطني هذه الدول من الجوانب السياسية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية، والتي تقاطعت كثيرا مع مصالح طبعا الدول كقوى سياسية. اليوم نعايش هذه الأزمة وبظهور تحديات على المستوى السياسي جعلت من هذه الدول تختلف في رؤاها وفي مستقبل دولها، وتغيرت التوجهات منذ أن كانت فكرة التعاون وظهور فكرة الاتحاد ثم فكرة تكامل، سواء كان تكامل على المستوى العسكري الأمني أو الاقتصادي أو الاجتماعي. لكن نتصادم اليوم أو ننصدم اليوم في تلاشي هذه الأحلام، ونتمنى أن لا تتلاشى وتختفي نهائيا، لكن يكون مجال للعودة وخط رجعة يوضح الرؤى ويحلل الأزمة بصورة عقلانية وواضحة تخدم مصالح الدول وتخدم كذلك شعوب هذه المنطقة. لدينا 3 متحدثين بعد اعتذار الدكتور محمد الرميحي. نبدأ بالمتحدث الأول الدكتور عبدالوهاب القصاب. وتعريف بسيط عن الدكتور عبدالوهاب القصاب: هو باحث مشارك في المركز العربي للأبحاث ودراسة السياسات، خبير في الشؤون العسكرية والتسلح، لواء بحري، ركن متقاعد في القوات المسلحة العراقية. عمل سابقا باحثا في مركز دراسات الوطن العربي في الجامعة المستنصرية، وباحثا في مركز الدراسات الدولية في جامعة بغداد، وفي بيت الحكمة في بغداد، ومستشارا لعدة مراكز بحثية. له الكثير من المقالات والكتب المترجمة والمؤلفة. موضوع الورقة التي سيقدمها لنا الدكتور عبدالوهاب هو صافي الخسارة الاستراتيجية لدول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربي في ضوء الأزمة الخليجية. نمنح الدكتور عبدالوهاب 15 دقيقة. عندنا غياب شخص، لكن نتمنى في النقاش في المحاورة ما نخسر وقت، لأن احنا اوريدي متأخرين 10 دقائق. شكرا جزيلا. تفضل.
شكرا جزيلا دكتورة شريفة. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الشكر طبعا موصول لمؤسستي اللي اعتز بها كثيرا، اللي هي المركز العربي للابحاث ودراسة السياسات، على إتاحة الفرصة لي لكي أشارك في هذا المنتدى الذي عاصرته منذ أن ابتدأ. ورقتي راح تكون بعنوان صافي الخسارة الاستراتيجية لدول مجلس التعاون الخليجي جراء الأزمة القطرية
ضعيف كل اللي عندي.
يعني كلمة صافي تبدو هذه راح تتعامل مع يعني أكثر ما انعكس سلبا على طبيعة العلاقة البينية لمجموعة دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي، المؤسسة المهمة حقيقة التي ظلت ثابتة في موقعها منذ أن أنشئت في أوائل الثمانينات القرن الموصل، ولكنها عانت من هزات كثيرة. فقط أعنف الهزات من الهزتين الأخيرتين، الهزتان الأخيرتان اللتان حدثتا 2013 والآن. الورقة راح تناقش هذا الموضوع تحت مجموعة عناوين، وأنا أحاول نتيجة الورقة طبعا تدرس 7000 كلمة، يعني 20 صفحة تقريبا، لكنه سأحاول أن ألقي ضوء على كل واحدة من المرتكزات الأساسية التي شكلت هيكلية هذه الورقة. الورقة بعد المدخل البسيط اللي راح أعرف به عنها راح تأخذ سمات الأزمة الحالية symptoms، ثم تأخذ أبعاد هذه الأزمة، ومن ضمن الأبعاد راح تناقش العامل النفسي كأحد أبعاد هذه، لأن العامل النفسي دور كبير جدا في بناء وتفاقم الوضع في منطقة الخليج في هذه الأزمة. ثم ستأخذ الورقة الموقف العسكري من ناحية الإخفاقات الاستراتيجية والتحالفات القائمة والتحالفات التي أنتجتها الأزمة. لدينا 3 اتجاهات، 3 طبقات: إخفاق وتحالفات قائمة وتحالفات أنتجتها الأزمة. ثم ستأخذ الورقة أيضا موضوعات البعد الاقتصادي للأزمة باعتبارها من مؤشرات صافي الخسارة الاستراتيجية، بعد أن تلقي ضوءا على سمات اقتصادية خليجية محددة تشكل الشكل العام للحياة الاقتصادية في الخليج، ثم ستخلص إلى مجموعة من الخلاصة والاستنتاجات دون أن تعطي توصيات. يعني كمدخل هو الرأي العام حقيقة في العالم والرأي العام لدى الحكومات الخليجية عدا دول الأزمة. وأنا ما أعرف مخطئ أو محق، استنبطت النفسي وأشاركهم بفد مصطلح لهذه الدول. أنا سميت دول الأزمة هي دول 3+1، والثلاثة هي الدول الثلاثة الأعضاء الأصيلة في مجلس التعاون الخليجي اللي هي السعودية والإمارات والبحرين، وزائد واحد هي مصر، وزائد واحد هي مصر. مصر عامل خلينا نقول طارئ وأسهمت في إشعال الحريق، أرزنست، يعني أسهمت في عملية إشعال الحرائق في هذه المنطقة، ولذلك هي ليست عضواً أصيلاً لكنها عضواً مضافاً، مع كل الاعتبار طبعاً لمصر التي يعتز بها كل عربي، لكن نحن نتحدث على هذه المرحلة. فالمفاجأة كانت موجودة بالطريقة التي أعلنت بها هذه الأزمة، وهي كانت حتى تفوقت على سابقتها، يعني أزمة بيتت بليل، وفي فعلا الأزمة هذه وسابقتها ب 2013 بيتت، يعني ناس صحوا الصبح كان رمضان كانت أزمة، والناس فوجئت إيش هذا الذي يجري، يعني دون سابق انذار. قبل يومين ثلاثة كانوا في الرياض، واحد واقف جنب الآخر، ما كان في بين إشكال، لم يثر أي نوع من أنواع الإشكالات، لكنه رأينا كيف تفاقم الوضع. حقيقة يعني كان واضح أيضا أن للرئيس ترامب دور ما، كان واضح من دوره في قمة الرياض كيف كان واقف، كيف دعم محمد بن سلمان، وقفوا جنبه، مسكوا من إيده، كان هنالك شيء من التناغم يثير الانتباه ويثير الاهتمام. الآن الذي يعود إلى الصورة الجماعية ويشوف كيف ترامب صاحوا لمحمد الشيخ محمد بن زايد بطريقة يعني تثير الانتباه. بعدين أيضا من الهيكلية اللي انبنت عليها الورقة هي المبادئ أو الأهداف 13 التي قدمت لقطر أو لطلب انصياع قطر لكي يتم يعني من وجهة نظر الدول الثلاثة أيضا زائد واحد يعني إعادة تأهيلها واحتوائها كما يقولون. لكن هنا أيضا من الأمور المهمة جدا علينا أن نشير إلى دور رائد بذل سمو الشيخ صباح أمير دولة الكويت، واللي قدم نفسه يعني بحكمة معينة لكي يحاول أن يجد حلا لهذه الأزمة، وبذل جهد كبير وحظى على تأييد عالمي منقطع النظير. لكن يبدو كما يبين من كلمات الشيخ صباح أنه كان هنالك عدم تعاون من جهة 3+4. طيب ننتقل بشكل سريع إلى سمات هذه الأزمة التي تتميز بها والتي تختلف. هذه الأزمة أولا هي أزمة غير مسبوقة في إخراجها، إذ تجاوزت حدود اللياقة المتعارف عليها بين القادة الخليجيين على الأقل. هنالك شيء من أدب التعامل المعروف بالخليج، ما في واحد يروح للعظم، هذه شفناها يعني أخذت اللحم ثم ذهبت إلى العظم ثم ذهبت حتى إلى الدم. بعدين السمة الثانية أن هذه الأزمة شخصانية أكثر مما تتعامل، يعني شخصانية جدا، شخصانية بامتياز. إذا نشوف هيكلية الدول التي تنتظم بها دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي، ما نشوف هنالك مرتكزات وأساس لانطلاق أزمة بهذا الحجم. هنالك فريكشن، هنالك احتكاك، هنالك امتعاض، هنالك عدم قبول، لكن ليس هنالك خندق واسع النطاق يأثر أو يدفع باتجاه مثل هذه الأزمة. ثم هذه الأزمة أيضا تجاوزت
such a crisis has gone beyond the humanitarian side and has left the governments and gone to the peoples. It's a sort of a race between the vital players from outside the country to play a role in this regard. The 3+1 bloc has failed to gain support on the international level. The Qatari diplomacy was vital in the crisis. Have a look to the performance of Adil Al-Jubair of Saudi Arabia and Sheikh Mohammed Al Thani of Qatar on the international scenes during the course of the crisis. Even in the States, even in the United States of America, a lot of the 3+1 bloc have thought they can have a momentum and support, but no way. The Qatari diplomacy has done a lot in this regard, and Sheikh Mohammed Al Thani, the Qatari foreign minister, has been our guest in Washington, and the conference hall or the meeting hall was completely full of the audience who want to listen to him. Also, the crisis has paved the way massively for Iran to play a role in this region because of the blockade imposed on Qatar from one side, and because the Gulf peoples have been in clash. So there was a space for Iran to go and to play a role. Finally, I'd like to say that the crisis might be open for some good time. We cannot expect a time limit for this crisis, and to prove that, yesterday, His Excellency the Qatari Foreign Minister have mentioned things about that. So let's say the dimensions are numerous: security dimension and social dimension, the security between the countries, the security in the region, and the security on the international level might be affected at the same time. And it has opened a space for Iran to play a bigger role, a clear role, and I'd like to draw attention to what has happened after the Kuwaiti invasion, when Iran has started again to reconcile with its enemy, with Iraq. They have been into a long war for several years, and we were eyewitnesses for that period, and the delegations coming here and there. As the Egyptian said, everything is now, it was okay. And let's talk about the Iranian-Syrian-Iraq coalition, Saddam Hussein and Al-Khomeini at that time. We will discuss also the losses and the benefits of this crisis. This is quite important. And the Arab Gulf crisis has been a sort of a hit. But I will point out to the case in Yemen, and how can Yemen be a place for the Arab blood to be shed. And also the density of the population over there, that might be an element in this connection. We have also other dimensions, as those who try to mediate for a solution. A lot of people have come to the area for sorting out the crisis, and the invoice from the US, invoice from here and there, and the efforts that has been exerted from the point of view to sort out the problem. On the other hand, the regional institutions have also failed to introduce a solution. The GCC, we haven't heard the Secretary General of the GCC talking or speaking about that. He only spoke a few weeks ago. The Arab League at the same time, and the Secretary General of the Arab League was the voice of his master, and this has been a big failure for the Arab common work. On the other hand, we have seen 3 countries in the Gulf want to create another country, and we have Oman, the Sultanate of Oman, and Kuwait and Qatar are trying to find a solution. This has been a negative element that might give us the impression that the GCC has failed in its mission and is not anymore able to do more than that. Also, I'm talking quickly to cover all my points. Psychologically, we can say that it's important in a country without institutions. In the States, for example, the States has a president who behaves in a way that is different than the approach of the country as a whole. In our region, we have two cases. Once again, I'd like to say the invasion of Kuwait in 1991 and this crisis. The decision maker is one, the consequences are dangerous and the region will be under a threat. So we need to put this psychological element into account, and we need to find a solution in order to not to affect the general policies of the countries. Also, I'd like to say that the military position, which is most important, matter of fact, the big problem, or the biggest problem within the GCC is that the GCC has failed to build a military doctrine for the Gulf Cooperation Council in order to know the potential enemies, what are the procedures, how do we work together. And we have Al Jazeera Shield after the Kuwaiti problem. Jazeera Shield have been big failure, and there was a challenge, a big challenge in Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, supported by the Gulf countries, have take some procedures. That's why the absence and the lack of a military doctrine is not good, because the countries have bought a lot of weapons from so many sources. On top of the sources comes the United States of America, and it looks like a fixed item in the budgets of the countries. And we have a timetable that shows the share of the individual from the budget of the country when it comes to weapons purchases, and I have mentioned Egypt in this connection. So this is a very element that has a lot of negative impact. Also, I'd like to say that the operation of Saudi Arabia in Yemen, that must have been studied perfectly in order to know more about the characteristics of Yemen. And Saudi Arabia is a neighbor to Yemen and has been in 1967 together with Egyptian forces in such an operation in Yemen. So the Saudis have to study well the situation, and Saudi Arabia has at the same time to study more in order to put Ali Saleh aside and to study the Houthis more. And we have seen what has been going on for the recent few days. One more thing, we have developed weapon machines, and if compared to what Iran has when it comes to the aerial raids, we can say they are better than the Iranian forces. It's quite impossible to imagine a land operation between the two sides. We have so many kinds of operations where the GCC countries have superiority. But if we go back to the Yemen situation, we can say that it was not wise enough to storm Yemen. We have 5 timetables that include so many comparisons, and I'd like to point here to the failure of building a coalition, as our colleague said yesterday when he talked about Pakistan. Pakistan has gained a lot from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has supported a lot Pakistan, and when it comes to the moment of truth, Pakistan was not that support side to Saudi Arabia. Also, when the Qatari problem starts, Pakistan was also not supporting the Qatari side. We need to know the Iranian situation, the Iranian role when it comes to the Pakistan involvement. I'll try to say a few words about the demography, and I pointed out to Yemen. Yemen has been an important country. I am from Iraq, and 90% of Iraqis have, in a way or another, relations to Yemen. The GCC countries also has done a lot to Iraq and Yemen. The coalitions, the main coalition is the GCC. We also have another coalition with the 4 permanent members of the council after the Kuwaiti invasion. There was also a coalition between the GCC and Syria and Egypt in this particular period that is called 6+2. And after the Kuwaiti problem sorted out, then everything gone back to 0 point. Also, the GCC, Morocco, and Jordan have been trying to consist a coalition, but no big role on the ground. We also see now military maneuvers. We have Qatar plus Turkey, Qatar, and each of the main powers in the region where they have military exercises together. And we have seen agreement with France. We have seen maneuvers with Britain. The question is, do you think the main superpowers will support the GCC in this connection? Because I feel that storming Yemen will never happen again in this region. You have taken your 7 minutes. I have a lot to say. Okay. Quickly, please. Okay. Finally, the main reason of the crisis is the lack of the realistic vision and the lack of the nice behavior between countries. Ahmed, Shafiq, Kamil, well, Dr. Al-Hariri has a problem of Lebanon. The president, legitimate president of Yemen, was in trouble. So we don't have that code of ethics to behave, or for the countries to behave with each other. Another problem, even the 13 items have no real problems. Thank you very much. And I apologize for taking more than my allocated time. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abdulwahab Al-Qassab.
Actually, the paper has given human and psychological aspects more than the theories that has been summarized extensively over the last 2 days. The situation which the region passes through is much more like a political catastrophe. These issues that has been taken place has been criminalized, because if you have any sympathy towards any state like Qatar, you will be criminalized in some of the blockade countries. We have also witnessed it daily that is totally contradictory to the human positions. The crisis has some consequences and negative points. However, the much we could say in this paper that the net losses is actually losses on the political dimension and the social dimension, because there's a lot of social relations between the peoples of the nations that are blockading Qatar. The issues, we will move to Dr. Ahmed Üçağaç. He's a assistant professors in Sakarya University in Turkey. He graduated from International Relations Department from Istanbul University. He's an MA. Now he a PhD student, and hopefully he will have the degree soon in the international relations in Turkish University. He has a lot of publications in international regulars. He has a lot of studies on the Gulf area. The topic of his thesis is that the component of regional security in the Middle East, GCC case studies. The title of the paper is The Gulf Crisis, an attempt to alter the regional order.
I'm going to make a presentation today about the regional order in the Gulf. In my presentation, my ultimate aim is to find out an answer to the question of whether the recent developments, especially the Gulf crisis in the region, are attempts to change the regional order. So, in my paper, I try to analyze the outlines of the recent developments in the Gulf in the context of regional security complex. Since the essential structure and character of regional security complexes are defined by two kinds of relations, namely power relations and patterns of amity and enmity, I focus on the role of regional power relations and the patterns of amity and enmity in the regional order. Ever since the emergence of Gulf complex, a stable regional security order could not be established. The reasons behind the failure of establishing an order which will satisfy the regional actors are absence, asymmetry among the three poles, namely Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq, and the regimes of dubious legitimacy. However, many unsettled issues between the regional states have also had negative impacts on the regional affairs. Regarding the absence of asymmetry, while Iran's geography and population give it a naturally dominant position and strategic depth with its military and economic power, Iraq was also was able to compete with Iran and Arab Gulf states until the 1990s. On the other hand, Arab Gulf states have immense hydrocarbon and financial power, but they have not been that successful to transform this into a strategic way to balance Iraq or Iran. And that's what made US penetration into the region possible. Historically, Saudi-led GCC bloc has defended the strategic and political power status quo, but Iran and Iraq have not. Both Iran and Iraq have never been satisfied with the existing regional order and the roles they play within. While Iran believes that its legitimate position as a hegemon power in the Gulf has not been recognized, Iraq has long had both ambitions to be a major player in the Arab politics and sense of deep insecurities resulting from its oil exporting routes. Regarding the emergence of the Gulf regional security complex and its functioning, since the Britain's withdrawal from the Gulf in 1971, there have been repeated efforts to find an effective security order in the region. From that time to 2003, the regional order in the Gulf was shaped by three-polar system formed by Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. Up until 2003, the regional order in the Gulf was as if one of these regional poles gained too much weight, the other two tried to balance it. But the occupation of Iraq in 2003 has created an entirely new situation as it replaced the three-polar regional system with a two-polar one. When we look at the 1970s, the regional order at the time reveals a Saudi-Iranian coordination stemming from the threat of Arab nationalism. The reason why Arab nationalism was a threat at that time is Arab nationalism born as an anti-colonial struggle. As a result of this, it defined the monarchical system as continuation of colonialism. In 1958, the overthrow of King Faisal in Iraq by the nationalist forces created a precedent in the Gulf for toppling other monarchies. Therefore, monarchies such as Iran and Saudi Arabia considered Arab nationalism as an immediate threat, danger. Subsequently, both parties gaining power in 1968 and the Britain's decision to withdraw from the Gulf region by 1971 paved the way for the Saudi-Iranian coordination. The shared threat, perceptions, and common interest in fighting socialist and radical nationalist influences in the Gulf brought Iran and Saudi Arabia on the same page until the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. In that period, the primary political confrontation in the Gulf can be described as a conservative radical one, or a confrontation of status quo and revisionism. Meantime, by the British withdrawal, the US alerted and had to ensure that the expected power vacuum in the Gulf region, which is important both in terms of economy and strategy, would not be filled by Eastern Bloc countries or their regional allies, namely the Arab National Socialist Iraq. As a result, initiated by the US, the twin pillar policy was embraced by both Saudi Arabia and Iran, as the regional consequences had already forced the two to cooperate. So the regional order, when we look at the regional order after the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution in February 1971 altered the regional balance of power significantly, and Iran now became a source of concern for Iraq and Saudi Arabia. By declaring Islam to be the basis of Iranian Republic and by propagating the establishment of an Islamic State in Iran, the Iranian leadership was challenging the Saudis on their own field in terms of Islamic discourse. Because the Saudi claim that they were ruling according to the Islamic norms and traditions and looking after the safety of the holy places in Mecca and Medina had been the Saudis' most important argument for legitimacy. Moreover, Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of Iranian Revolution, started to propagate the notion that monarchy was basically non-Islamic and that a republic was the only form of state adequate to Islam. As a result of this, Iran and Saudi Arabia allied during the 1970s had become a bitter opponent. For Saudi Arabia, the Iranian foreign policy based on exporting the revolution was not less dangerous than the pan-Arabist policies of Iraq. So now the time to partner with Iraq against Iran. As Iraq's ideology had already lost ground to challenge Saudi regime. On the other side, since Iraq has perceived an existential threat from the new regime in Iran, the former waged war against the latter. And Saudi Arabia, at the first phase of the war, logistically, and after 1982, materially assisted once arc for Iraq. So the Kuwait crisis and the regional order. After the ceasefire of the 8-year war, the Saudis started to modify their politics towards Iran. The reasons behind this modification were Iran had been weakened considerably by the war and the danger of revolution export was diminished significantly. Saddam Hussein was behaving like an absolute winner after the war and flexing his muscles towards the Arab Gulf. As a result, Iraq's behavior in the aftermath of the war started to create an imbalance in the tripolar system. For these reasons, Saudis were no longer interested in further weakening Iran. Moreover, the weakened Iran after the war was also eager to approach to other side of the Gulf. And the rapprochement between these two resulted with a detente. So reasons for this detente were less than 2 years after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and according to some information, Iraq had intentions to carry the war deep into the Saudi oil province of Al-Hassa. For that reason, Iraq was once again appeared to be a threat to Saudi Arabia. And this U-turn in Iraq's position resulted in a detente between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Ultimately, on March 19, 1991, Iran and Saudi Arabia restored their diplomatic relations. In this period, Iran had made big efforts to keep the US out of the regional security arrangements for the future. Iranians had insisted on the integration of Iran in such arrangements. Iranian leadership had also emphasized the GCC's open concepts of self-reliance and Gulfanization. Iran had hoped that such a strategy would reduce the GCC's foreign dependency and its reliance on the US in particular. On the other hand, the sudden prospect of security cooperation between Iran and the GCC started to alarm Washington, because the American military protection of the Gulf Arab states could be the only factor which would legitimize the presence of the US in the region. So the absence of a threatening Iraq in order to convince the Gulf Arabs, Americans started to portray Iran as the main regional threat to the GCC members. Subsequently, Washington offered official security treaties to every interested state in the GCC, and the GCC state agreed with the US and supported the strategy of dual containment of both Iran and Iraq. At that time, there were two reasons behind the GCC's decisions. The first one, unfinished threat perception from Iran, and the second one, being weak in terms of defense, self-defense, and weary after the Second Gulf War. The occupation of Iraq and the emergence of regional imbalance. Iraq was occupied in 2003. The weakening of Iraq had far-reaching repercussions for the other two poles, namely Saudi Arabia and Iran. With the occupation, the traditional three-polar system has been reduced to a bipolar one, made up of Saudi Arabia and Iran. The disqualification of Iraq has shaken the regional balance of power and created an imbalance. Iraq's exclusion from the game has destroyed Iran's and Saudi Arabia's arch enemy, but at the same time it has made Saudi Arabia more vulnerable against Iran. Because in a Lebanonized political system, Iran has started to instrumentalize the Iraqi Shiites, but on the other hand, the lack of experience and capacity led to Saudi failure to create influence over the Iraqi politics. So let me focus on the regional order amid the Arab uprising, which is the start of a new era in the regional security system. The beginning of the Arab Spring was the period of regime change. However, it also became the return of reactionary regime security politics against both internal and external challenges. So while the occupation of Iraq has shaken the regional balance of power, the Arab uprising has intensified and sharpened internal regime security concerns. And the responses by the Gulf states to these concerns have been both as domestic security crackdowns and regional foreign policy initiatives. The fact that losing against Iran almost on every front and Iran's superiority in terms of both material and ideational mean has forced Saudi Arabia to turn back to traditional balancing policies in the Gulf. As it seems, Saudi Arabia alone is not able to confront Iran in the region. For that reason, Riyadh-led bloc has started to soften its anti-Shiite discourse and adopt a relatively pan-Arabist stance towards Iraq recently. As I mentioned before, along with a power-accumulating neighbor, authoritarian regimes face threat to their own power and survival from within too. For example, Iran's threat to Saudi Arabia stems not only from the pursuit of nuclear weapons, but also from its potential of influence on the Saudi Shiites. In a similar way, the coordinated campaigns against the Muslim Brotherhood by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates reflects the logic of securing domestic power through foreign policy activism. So I think recent developments in the Gulf, particularly blockade of Qatar and rapprochement with Iraq, reflect Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates' attempt to reshape the regional landscape in a pattern that isolates Iran and contains the bloc's influence, or at least to re-establish regional balance. Putting it in another word, by these attempts, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who envision an authoritarian neoliberal order rather than a pluralistic democratic one for the region, aim to fully assert their hegemony over the region, which is to put Qatar back in its place and to isolate or contain Iran. Assume the leadership role in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia seems to be determined to eliminate any rival Arab powers and would only accept Arab countries as subservient clients in need of it. For such a position, the accepted Arab is who does not seek autonomy. As a conclusion, I can say that regime security dynamics and security dilemmas continue to drive regional alliance politics. And finally, while the bipolar regional system has led the actors to aggression and expansionism, concerns about regime security has been a major determinant of the patterns of enmity relations between the regional actors. And thank you for listening.
شكرا جزيلا
Thank you very much. Ahmed, you have abided by the time limit, and we will go through what you have said. It was a sort of a reading to the security and political situation in the region and the real positions and roles played by the countries individually, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the blockading countries in dealing with the Qatari crisis. And it seems like the political...
Now we move to the second speaker in this session, Dr. David Roches. He is a co-professor in the Far East Center for Southeast Asia Studies. He is specialized in Arab Gulf area and GCC countries, and security of borders and missile defense and terrorism. We are afraid that we might end up in a real war. He joined the Far East Center after he had several positions in the defense ministry. He was the director of Al-Khalij and Peninsula Center. He was also the regional director for Pakistan and the operation manager for NATO and the vice president for peacekeeping forces and other positions. The paper he will give is the military cooperation between GCC countries, Unfulfilled Promise. Now he has 15 minutes to give his speech.
اسمي أبو براين ولست أتكلم للحكومة الولايات المتحدة. My name is Dave DeRoche. I'm very grateful the interpreters showed up because my Arabic has been described as interesting, if not amusing. And in the past, I have described myself as the former military dictator of Pakistan, and I once introduced the British Consul General in Istanbul as the British prophet to Turkey. So my remarks do not reflect any U.S. government involvement. And if we get the slides of, yes, Mumtaz, this is my email, my Facebook, my Twitter. Please follow me, and I will be delighted to hear your things. In light of the last talk, I should point out I am a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute of Washington, which I believe is fully funded by the United Arab Emirates. I am an active member of the Middle East Institute, which was mentioned in the last talk. I consider many of the people there personal friends, and if anybody thinks Jerry Firestein is shading his judgment based on the funding of his institution, I'd be more than happy to set you on the path to righteousness. I should also mention that I was briefly Mike Pompeo's roommate at West Point. Next slide. Sorry. This map is a chart taken from the British National Archives. It is a German plan stolen by a Belgian agent during World War II and used there. And what it shows are the German air defenses in 1940. The round circles indicate searchlights. The circles with little crosses above them indicate guns. And in each one of these boxes, a night fighter rotated. This was called the Klubhammer line. And the way the Royal Air Force defeated it, maybe I'll stand over here and do this instead of... Yeah, do you mind?
Much easier for you.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize. The way the Royal Air Force defeated this was by attacking one section at one time. Since there was only one fighter, by putting all the bombers in, they were able to overwhelm this. Now, what does this historical lesson show for us? Well, basically, this is the way the GCC states conduct their air defenses. Quite simply, if you consider this box to be the totality of the GCC right now, what you have is if there is a threat from outside that is massed in one sector, and I consider that there are only 2 countries in the GCC that are capable of defeating a massed air offensive. So if they are attacked in one sector, each of the GCC states will respond individually, and that one sector that is attacked will be overwhelmed. And then the rest of the states will be completely vulnerable to an attack from a direction they do not anticipate, just as the Kluivhammer line was ultimately defeated by the British. Now, what is better is if you have this sort of arrangement where GCC members accept risk and leave their own territory momentarily undefended or defended by somebody else, maneuver out of area and attack the threat from different directions. Good, okay. That's what we're moving towards, inshallah, or that's what we want to see movement towards. This is the bottom of a Tornado aircraft, and what it shows are the 13 attachment points where you can put on missiles, infrared guidance pods, bombs, or fuel tanks. Each one of these points requires not just a mechanical interface, which by and large is standardized because the aircraft were built for NATO members, so they're standardized, but it also requires a software interface. Now, those of you who have iPhones, imagine the grief that you go through every time there's a new iOS update and you have to reboot your operating system. Now imagine if you're installing that iOS on a Mac or a PC. Now imagine if you're doing it on a Russian computer that uses Russian proprietary software, or a French computer that uses French proprietary software. In order to integrate a Yemeni missile on a Kuwaiti fighter, even if they're both purchased from NATO countries, say France, the United States, you have to basically reveal the source code on the airplane. You have to surrender your source code and open up a vulnerability to your ally. So if there is not an atmosphere of complete trust and transparency, even if the fighters are of the same model because they're slightly variant, so an Emirati fighter, F-16, American-made, landing at a Kuwaiti base that flies F-18s, also American-made, but one's Boeing, one's Lockheed, the missiles will probably not be compatible because of software. And that requires a great level of coordination and transparency, which unfortunately we're not seeing today. The second area I want to talk about is missile defense. In the Riyadh weapons buy, there was, I think, $4 billion worth of Saudi launch detection satellites. In order to defend effectively against a missile, you have to have a tiered system. You have to detect the launch. Then you have radar that tracks the launch once it's cued by the launch detection. And then you have intercept radars and interceptors that are cued by a bigger radar system to do it. You can't keep all your radars operating continually. They are not that robust enough. This is not a hot water heater. The average air defense radar, the most modern state in the world, requires about 25% of its operating time to be inactive for maintenance. And you cannot constantly scan 360, if for no other reason than if you're doing that, potential adversaries will detect what frequency you're operating on and figure out how to jam it prior to a launch. So right now, all the GCC states are dependent on American satellite imagery to detect a launch. The problem is the United States has global responsibilities. And right now, North Korea is of more concern to us. There's a possibility that this would go away. So the Saudis are buying their own launch detection. Now, ideally, that Saudi launch detection in the future will be transferred to a radar that looks like this. This is an FPS 132 radar located at Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts. This provides the air defense early warning for the United States. This is a commercial variant of the same radar that has been deployed. This is in Taiwan. Qatar has been offered this radar. So what we're talking about, if there is to be an effective GCC air defense from across the Gulf, the only viable way it can be done without extreme American intervention is for the eventual Saudi satellite to detect the launch and cue the eventual Qatari theater radar, which would then cue the individual launch assets located in Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, etc. That requires seamless coordination. And the reason for that is because the flight time for a missile from Shiraz to Riyadh is probably less than 5 minutes. You're dealing with 300 seconds. You do not have enough time to take information off a screen, write it down, get your fellow GCC liaison officer at the Air Coordination Center in El Udeid, find him, pass him the information, and have him do it. By that time, the missile will have impacted. What we see, this is the American vision for coordination. Right now, we're in the chart on the left with unilateral national systems here. When one of these radars goes down for maintenance, or if there's just human error, and there often is human error when you have people operating such complex machinery, the bubble goes down. Bilateral coordination, mostly done with the United States, is a little bit more effective. That's the middle chart. But what we want to see, and I think what you want to see, is multinational coordination where there's a fully integrated defense, where when Bahrain's radar goes down, Qatar reorients its radars and provides coverage over Bahrain and Dhahran. Inshallah, that's what we're working towards. But right now, that cooperation isn't there because, again, it requires countries to accept momentary risk and to rely on their partners for effective cooperation. But in the absence of this, a volleyed attack in one sector will overwhelm that one sector and the whole system will fail. So, quite frankly, there is no effective military option to complex cooperation in which countries like Qatar accept momentary risk and accept protection from other countries and thus expose themselves to vulnerabilities. This shows in the interest of time, I'll blow through this, but the bottom line is if you're not fully integrated, then you have to set up an intermediate software network, say, to integrate that. And even if you only have 1% inefficiency at each one of these things, and assuming that your software works almost flawlessly and that there's no delay in time, because again, you're dealing with less than 300 seconds for a missile launched at Abu Dhabi or Doha from Bushehr, what you're going to get is a 4% failure rate. If each one of those transactions is 1% inefficient, that's a 4% failure rate, slightly more than 4%, which means that 1 out of every 25 missiles that would have been intercepted will land in Doha or Abu Dhabi. That's unacceptable. A higher level of coordination is military education. If you look at Qatar, they do not have a war college. The UAE has one war college, and their armed forces are about 64,000. The United Kingdom has 151,000 people in their military establishment. They have one war college. And the United States has 1.3 million. We have 6 war colleges. This would suggest that between 151,000 and 200,000 is the right number of soldiers to establish a war college, which would mean that there would be a war college in Saudi Arabia, and there would be a war college covering the rest of the GCC, and they should be pooled for max efficiency. And this would lead to commonality of education, which, quite frankly, if people are thinking in the same terms, it's much easier to make the equipment follow the thinking than the thinking follow the equipment. Without this, what you have is wasteful, duplicative infrastructure and educational incompatibility, which will doom that. So the numbers need to be, that capacity is more optimal if it's pooled, and it's cheaper. May not be a concern, but should be. That's the right size. I've gone very, very briefly because when the paper comes out, you can read the paper and criticize it, and I'd rather take your questions. But again, there's my Twitter, my Facebook, and my email if you have any questions. My son tells me that my sole validation as a human being are the number of people who follow me on Twitter, so please feel free to do that. And thank you for your patience, and thank you, madam, for letting me get my slides up.
Thank you, David, for making it very short, and I totally understand. نشكر مرة ثانية ديفيد دي روش على الطرح
his presentation. It is always in our minds as individuals in the GCC countries. Why? This question has been reckoning a lot in our minds. Why we spend all such funds and amounts to purchase weapons? Why some countries, the GCC countries, comes at the top of the list of the countries that purchase weapons? They spend huge amounts of money on purchasing weapons. Is it for military mobilization? The region will witness a war once again, regional war once again. A lot of questions in our mind, but it is clear that such weapons just for the protection of strategic interests and political interests for the whole region through the cooperation of the GCC countries. And it was during the Kuwait war or the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. It was for preparation of a unified Arab GCC Arab military army, but that was just a dream, and it's a promise that never come true. So the military power in the Gulf differs, as David has explained. So each country in the GCC countries, its power varies from the other countries. However, what is common now is the military power to purchase weapons and for military and human mobilization. Now we open the floor for questions. Since we have less than 30 minutes, we would like the questions to stick to the topics of the discussion and the topics of the papers we have listened so far. So if you have other type of questions, you can keep during the break. However, we would like the questions to stick to the topics of the papers and presentations. Now we open the floor for questions.
Yeah, I'll try and follow your instructions and be very, very quick and very, very precise. And this is really to Abdulwahab and to Ahmed. I mean, the story which comes across from both of you is of course a depressing one over time, where ideas about security develop and break down, and one arrangement gives way to another. And there's an underlying competition and rivalry continuing over the whole period. Do you actually see any prospect of beginning to work towards some kind of collective security arrangements in the region, some kind of a security community where one can have something which brings together all of the 8 countries around the Gulf on the basis of understandings or some basic understandings about the limits of what each does and how they can cooperate within the region?
Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah? Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting presentations. People have been predicting the demise of the Saudi regime for many years, but it looks like it could go down soon. So what scenarios do you see for a post-Saudi Arabia? What is the #1 threat, and what would US policy be? Thank you.
أسئلة أخرى؟
Assalamu alaikum. So when I look to Mr. Tobish explaining these arms and highly costing arms, highly technology arms, I'm shocked. Why? In Iraq now, Shia militia is fighting under the cover of alliance aeroplanes, means America. Daesh is withdrawing to safe haven under the cover of American airplanes. Why don't you give us technology, machines, factories to cultivate our land, to live our living standards, to live like a human being? Then there will be no illegal immigration, will be no Daesh. You are igniting crisis in our countries that you can, in Raqqa, 4,000 raids on Raqqa to destroy it. All Iraqi villages are destroyed. Why are you destroying our lands? Please leave us in peace. We can solve our problems. We have now negotiations with Israel. Why don't we make negotiations with Iran? Iran is a Muslim. So I am so shocked. I am astonished. Thank you.
شكرا. تفضل.
It's okay. Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Regarding the security cooperation which you are talking about and saying that it's unfulfilled between the Gulf states, now with this Gulf crisis, right now with this Gulf crisis and how do you see the future of military cooperation as you just explained? Is there any chance for military cooperation following this Gulf crisis? That's number one. Number two, a question order for Mr. I don't know the name exactly, that director of center there. Yeah. بخصوص التحالفات.
As for the coalition, as the GCC or the shield forces, all these issues have become history. It's useless now. Now there is a new coalition, a new Islamic coalition under the leadership of Saudi Arabia. It has 40 states. So the regional coalition even the cooperation between Qatar and Turkey, Qatar and other states. What will be the future if we have such a huge, big coalition between 40 states? What will be the status of the internal coalition? Will be any chance of the internal coalitions on the level of the GCC? Thank you. Is there any more questions?
سيدتي الرئيسة عبد الرضا السيري من جامعة الكويت.
Abdullah al-Wasiri from Kuwait University. In fact, I didn't like to make any intervention, but it hurts human being when he witnesses analysts expressing their own points of views with more than objectivity and reality and partialism. In the GCCs, we have internal crises. In each state of the GCCs and among each state, we have a lot of crises, and we are trying to export our internal crises to the external parties through creating new enemies. It is enough historically that we have a well-known enemy, the historical enemy, the original one. Now, such historical enemy has become a partner. And the neighbors and the neighboring countries, the Muslim neighbor countries, has become an enemy. So we went back to thousands of years ago. We have created new enemies. The problem is not in the West. Of course, the West has something to do with this, but we accept the Trump analysis and the Trump school. We have our own problems. Let us solve them together internally between us and our neighbors. I don't want to say that our neighbors are untouchables or have prophets. Each state has its own problems and crises. We have Palestine, so we forgot all about Palestinians, we forgot about all our Islamic concepts and created new enemy. Look at the Arab and the Muslims, the Gulf people. They're creating their own internal problems among each other, and you want us to be... thank you.
From the back. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hello, again, Mohamed from Georgetown University. A question for David, I guess, or for anybody in the room. Given the obvious necessity of absolute trust and seamless cooperation amongst, at the very least, the 6 GCC states, in order to have any chance at all of defense security being effective, have you or any of your contacts or colleagues in Washington, or perhaps in the region, picked up any sense that this argument is being heard?
Any more question? There's a question.
Okay, sorry. تفضل.
Hello, Islam Hassan from Georgetown University. My question is, well, it seems that the GCC states have been investing in defense arms, but what we've been seeing lately, especially in the past 2 years, is that small states in the Gulf have been overstretching in the sense that they've been keen on having military presence and naval presence elsewhere outside of the region, mainly in the Red Sea. What do we conclude from such developments?
اوكي تمام. انا بس تعقيبي ان
My
التعامل مع
comment
القضايا
is that dealing with such issues, we should differentiate between the state and the people of the state. We, as people of each state, we have emotional attitude, but as for the mind of the state is more objective. It takes into account the interests, the political interests, the economic interests. So there are two different perspectives towards one event. For example, the neighbor might be an enemy one day, then it might be a friend on the other day. So definitely we should, and we wish we have good relation between the neighboring countries. However, based on the nature of the international interests and the neighboring interests, it might differ from one time to another. For example, President Saddam Hussein was to defend the Arab. However, after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, he has become an enemy of the Arab states. So we try to find solutions for the issues different from the people of the United States. But so the objective analysis, we should put into account the interests and we'll find the real visions of each international regime or regional regime based on the interests of each or the nature of the state. One of the questions, Nasser Adwani, ex-officer of the Kuwaiti Armed Forces. I have one simple question, and as for the military capabilities of the GCC countries, and is it possible for the GCCs to absorb such defense mechanism or not? The GCC has established actual cooperation, huge one, in the field of information exchange and the exchange of training experiences. We have established, in fact, among the GCC, a very accurate mechanism and system. So on the ground, if Israel or Hezbollah launched a missile from Lebanon to Israel, we will see it immediately on our screens without the help of any other country. So the GCC have a very accurate information system and a very big and highly technical military cooperation. The problem is that we didn't move to the other stage. The other stage requires that we should have centralized operation centers. Such operation centers is the result of the failure of the military cooperation of the GCCs. The operation centers, I mean to manage the mutual operation centers, to direct the efforts of the GCCs. We have failed to achieve this goal. We just make parades, we make shows, but we don't achieve such a goal of establishing operation centers. These centers give authorities and powers to the people who work in such centers. So we need operation centers with certain authorities to enable them away from the political framework. However, as for the ability to absorb the weapons, all the weapons that were purchased and came into services, we have managed to understand and deal with them. Please, this is a statement not for promotion or propaganda. All the weapons, all the military weapons we have bought, for example, of the Iraqi-American war, when Saddam Hussein launched 7 cruise missile squad against the Americans, the Americans managed to destroy 3 or 4, and only 3 just reached its goals. For example, Saddam Hussein launched 9 missiles against Kuwait, but none of them reached its goals. So we depended on the Patriot defense missile, and we managed to defend any missiles, to prevent any missiles, and we managed to destroy any missiles that has been launched against Kuwait. This fact, please, don't be unfair to yourselves. Now we'll give the floor to the speakers to answer the questions.
الأخوة التي طرحوا التي لديهم
It's time
أسئلة
now to answer
والدقيقة
the
لكل
questions,
متحدث. نبدأ
and
بديفيد
every
كون
speaker
معظم
has only
الأسئلة
1
كانت
minute.
موجهة لكم.
Yes, Dave.
Me first? Okay. Well, first off, the gentleman saying, why doesn't the United States leave us alone? Look, I went to graduate school in England, and I was an Army officer at the time, so I'd go to the U.S. Embassy to get my mail. And one day I was walking to the embassy to get my mail, and there were two protests. One said, United States out of Eritrea, and the other protest said, United States save the Eritrean people. And as I was walking past these two competing protests, I said, if I stood on the street in New York with a $100 bill and said, I'll give this to the first person who could find Eritrea on a map, I'll have $100 in my pocket after 10 minutes. The bottom line is, everybody wants the United States to solve their problems, and the United States did leave Iraq. And what we did was we left a capable military capacity for the government, and Nouri al-Maliki turned the government into an armed wing of the Dawa party, and then we saw a state collapse. We got brought back in. It's hard for people in the Middle East, particularly who focus on security, to realize this, but the American instinct is actually isolationist, and most Americans don't want to have anything to do outside of their borders. But whenever we withdraw, we get something like Rwanda, or we hear people like Canon Makia who says, you have to come back and solve all this. So that's the burden of being a superpower, and we'll always be wrong on that. The second question I want to ask answer is the gentleman from talking about the Kuwaiti armed forces and support mechanisms and all that. There are the framework for these things, but they have to be built on, and that requires trust. And so if you have an operations center where a missile attack is known, but you can't just know about it, you have to have very precise coordinates, mathematical details, and unless you are fully integrated automatically, which means there's no humans in the link, there's no air in the link, which means that you have to give up the operational code of your operational center and render yourself vulnerable, then that is a problem. And to have an integrated air defense system means, for example, that each country has to draw up its list of defended assets, which means it draws up a list of assets that are not defended. So if we're looking at the United States, if the United States integrated air defense list in order is Washington, New York, and then Boston, and we share this with the Canadians, and we have a problem with the Canadians, it's quite possible that they might go to the Bostonians and say, hey, you're only number 3 in priority to cause trouble. And I think within the Gulf, we're looking at that situation right now. We're just not there. So then we have the question from the gentleman from Sudan, what's the future of a military operation? I view the military capacity of the GCC as sort of an incubating giant, to be honest. And what happens is, when there is not an overwhelming threat, it sleeps. And when there is a threat, it comes back to life. And what this shows right now is that the members of the GCC just don't feel threatened enough to get serious about their cooperative defense. The problem is, I don't wake up and instantly start running. I usually have to shake things, listen to the cracks and breaks for a while, stretch my neck, have a cup of coffee, and then I go running. But the nature of modern warfare does not allow for that luxury. And so unless these structures and these mutual vulnerabilities are exchanged in peacetime, there may not be enough time to react. And that's 3 questions in 1 minute.
Thank you very much.
لا شكر لواجب.
الآن الأجوبة من قبل الدكتور القصاب. تفضل.
Answer from Dr. Al-Qassab. You have 2 minutes. Thank you very much. I'd like to concentrate on the main issue of the GCC, which is the security matter. The GCC has been created and established in 1980 to respond to a certain threat, the Iraqi-Iranian war. That must be studied well. The problem of the GCC, the security element there, is a problem because there is a lack of a lot of things, and the GCC has to be aware of that. The GCC countries have forgotten to look at the Red Sea. The Red Sea is a scene of wars, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Israel. And now, to solve that problematic security matter, you need to analyze the threats. You need to know who is your enemy, the potential enemy. to build your military doctrine according to this, to have the weapons necessary to face this. I don't know whether I have answered properly or not. I wanted to concentrate on this matter despite other questions, and the questions will be answered by my colleagues. Yes, Ahmed.
Thank you for your question. I think I have just one question. Can a regional arrangement be established in the region in the short run? I think your question is somehow like this. So I'm not optimistic that a stable regional order or arrangement can be established in the short run. Why? Because as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there is still a symmetry among the regional actors, which intensify the security dilemma, and there is still and regimes still does not enjoy wide legitimacy, which puts the regime security on the top of agenda. So the other reasons, there are still unresolved issues like Bahraini issues, like between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia or Gulf Arabs still think that Iran does not fully recognize Bahrain as an independent country. And the three islands between Iran and United Arab Emirates. And the other reasons, GCC states still cannot confront Iran alone, and they still depend on United States. So under these circumstances, I don't think that a native regional order or arrangement can be established. And with the US interference, I don't think that a stable and a healthy regional arrangement can be established in the region. Thank you.
At the end of this session about the integration in the Gulf, we need to thank the speakers of the panel, Abdulwahab Al-Qassab, David Roches, Ahmet Üçağaç, for their valuable contribution that revealed a lot about the current Gulf crisis, particularly from the military and security side. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you.